It's finally Friday. It's Friday, Friday.
Thank God it's
All right, welcome back to the Friday Show, presented this week by the Match Series. We'll tell you where it's headed this weekend coming up. Plus, it's the 159th running of the Queen's Plate. We'll talk about that in a minute as well. But first, Ray, we had a commentary this week from attorney Alan Pincus, who's in Pennsylvania and very concerned about some of the things that have been happening in the standardbred world in Pennsylvania. What did you make of what he had to say?
Well, first of all, it's very troubling that they had some positive tests that were called by the state's lab, including a class 1, and we had an article about that a week ago from Joe Gorachek, basically that were being swept under the rug or ignored. The Racing Commission is divided into two sections, the standardbred and the thoroughbred. This happened on the standardbred or the harness racing side. But the real problem is that when Pennsylvania reorganized their racing commission a few years ago, they created a conflict of interest by insisting that a representative of the horse owners would not only be on the board from both standardbred and thoroughbred, not only be on the board, but have sort of more authority than anybody else. So there is an inherent conflict of interest when you have horsemen regulating horsemen, and that's what happened here. These positives occurred when there was kind of a transition from some of the old board to the new board, but that's really no excuse.
And when Pincus does the right thing by asking questions about these positives that were buried, essentially, and he has paperwork to prove it, the response he gets is, get out of my office. You don't know what you're talking about, or these were illegally obtained documents, and if these are publicized, we're going to sue. Okay, that is a really constructive attitude, and that is really the heart of the problem here. Not only just horsemen regulating horsemen, but then their response of always stonewalling, always resisting, hiding in the shadows. And that is the exact opposite of what racing needs. It needs more light being shined in these areas and more transparency.
Yeah, earlier this week, the Pennsylvania Horse Racing Commission had their annual monthly meeting, and they rushed through an agenda, and they were done in less than an hour. And at the end, they talked about nothing of substance. And at the end of the meeting, there was applause because it got over so quickly. It's just sort of beyond me that the way they operate is not transparent. They spend more time, it seems like, in executive session than they do in front of the public, and to me, that's a problem.
And when you add this situation to what Gorachek said last week, and then Rick Arthur out in California getting very upset because horsemen are, again, stonewalling, resisting out of competition testing in California, and he is making the excellent point that, if you want the cheaters to take over the sport, then maybe you stand idly by. But if you want to be able to compete fairly and honestly, the sport needs this. It needs out of competition testing. It needs better investigative things, as we talked about last week, with respect to the Horse Racing Integrity Act.
Yeah, we've talked about this before. This is why I support the Horse Racing Integrity Act, because California, for example, I think it took them 5 years to get to third-party LASIX. They've been working on this out-of-competition language for more than a couple of years, and it's absurd that while the horsemen in California are members of the Racing Medication Testing Consortium that came up with the language for this, then they oppose what they came up with. It just makes no sense. And again, it comes down to you want the horsemen to have a say, you want them to have input, but to me it looks like in California the horsemen are running the process, and that's not good.
Yeah, that's a conflict of interest, and it's the same way in Pennsylvania with respect to what we just talked about. You also wrote a commentary this week saying it might be time for anti-Lasix, race day Lasix advocates to give up the fight with respect to the Horse Racing Integrity Act, because horsemen are so entrenched in their position. They're not going to change. They only dig in further when you fight back about it. And to me, you have a good point there. I hate to say it, that's the way to go. But I think the most important part of the Horse Racing Integrity Act is the oversight, the independent oversight.
Yeah, the independent oversight that will allow the sport to move forward on these issues instead of waiting years to get something passed in terms of out of competition testing or investigators on the ground. We need a central authority to manage the entire medication issue, from policy to testing to enforcement. It's just so uneven across the country, and it's one of those. In horse racing, 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2 or 3. It seems like to me that 1 + 1 equals about 1.5, and we need to get to where there's more efficiency in having one group managing everything. And it's not the biggest thing that I hear is, oh, I don't want the federal government to get involved. Well, they're not really getting involved other than saying, we're going to create this thing that's independent, non-governmental, and once it's created, we're not involved. So it is not a government intervention, and that's the number one complaint I hear, and it's totally misunderstood by the horsemen.
Well, you said create this thing. Well, it already exists. I mean, USADA already exists, and as you point out, it's a non-profit, non-governmental operation. And I think it's a valuable tool for racing to have some sort of structure, as you're mentioning, that doesn't exist now, that causes all this angst. And I just wonder where the voice of the horsemen who are playing by the rules, where that voice is, because I don't hear it a whole lot. And the other thing that bothers me is everything's so focused on medication overages. The tiniest amount of a medication that's legal, and they're going after people for that stuff. Meanwhile, other stuff's going on that's not getting caught. That bothers me too.
Yeah, as I wrote, it seems to me that most racing commissions spend all of their time adjudicating cases of overages of a perfectly legitimate therapeutic medication. And I don't get it. The horsemen who know the system isn't working properly should be behind this legislation, especially if they would get the Lasix language out of it, because to me that's the biggest holdup on getting support, getting more support from horsemen.
All right, let's move on and talk about this weekend's Queen's Plate. It is the 159th running, which is remarkable. Great field. I mean, field of 16. It's always an interesting race because it comes at a time of year, where you've got all 3-year-olds all foaled in Canada, and the fillies and boys race against each other in this race. The fillies often win the race. How do you see this one playing out?
Well, I've seen this race before, where lightly raced horses jump up and do really well. And Strike Me Down is one of those horses, trained by Graham Motion. Samson Farm owns and bred this Tappet colt, very lightly raced. There's some talent in this race. Telekinesis is good, and the fillies are good. But I just think this 10-to-1 shot, Strike Me Down, is coming up to the race really well for Graham Motion and can pull an upset.
All right. The horse I like is one of the favorites, and it's a filly, Wonder Godot. She finished a narrow second to Monomoy Girl, who is sensational in the Kentucky Oaks. In her last 5 races, she's lost by a total of 5 lengths. She hasn't won any of them, but by a total of 5 lengths in 5 races, she's finished on the board every time, and she's getting blinkers. And I think she's going to send, and they may have to run her down. So I'm going to go with Wonder Godot to win the Queen's Plate. The match series is at Monmouth Park this weekend, the Philip Island Stakes. Now, this is the older division on dirt going long, and Paige McKenney is actually leading that division and is in this race.
Yeah, I don't see Paige McKenney losing. Mary Epler is a trainer who really, I think, is using the match series. She's very aware of the points for the horses, for the trainers. You know, she's a perfect example of someone who gets it. Paige McKenney won the Salvatore Mile. I see nothing in here to beat him in the Islin.
All right, that's going to do it for this edition of the Friday Show, presented by the Match Series. Thanks for joining us. We'll talk to you soon.